All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and thank you for joining me on another edition of the podcast. This week, I want to talk a little NBA and talk about, more specifically, NBA ratings. There was a report that came out recently that as of from a year ago today, the NBA ratings are down 19. If you factor in NBA TV, it actually goes down to 25%. And this has caused a lot of speculation, commentary on the general health of basketball and of the NBA brand of basketball specifically. There's been a lot of think pieces written, a lot of opinions and takes out there just kind of hypothesizing what's wrong with the NBA. I think that there's a lot of ways you can go with this, right? A lot of different culprits, so to speak. And I think that some of it is the whole basketball media apparatus. Some of it is down to the style of play aspect. And some of it is just what the NBA is up against. So I kind of wanted to talk about a few of those things. So first things first, let's talk about the media aspect around the NBA. So the NBA recently just had a massive television deal that they signed, and the way they're going about it is that they, much like the NFL, are going to a bunch of different providers. Amazon's getting in, Netflix getting in, ESPN, all these streamers and traditional cable streaming companies as well are all kind of getting in on the action to get the NBA. And the reason they're all doing that is because the thing that people tune in for these days is live sports. It's why Netflix has an NFL game. It's why the college football playoff rights are going to be crazy when those come up for renegotiation. It's why the deals just go up and up every time, because the only real incentive you have for like appointment television these days is live sports. Even news is kind of on demand now. So everything is really, if it's not like an election year, which we just passed here in the US, then it's live sports and live sports only. That's not new. But there's a frustration that has come with this because now a lot of people are thinking about it in the sense of, man, I have to subscribe to all these different things just to watch the NBA. Same way I have to subscribe to all this different stuff just to watch the NFL. And I think that where the leagues say it's function of choice, a vehicle of choice, and having it across the board on all these different providers, your average person is kind of like, this isn't really what I wanted. I want to be able to just sign up for League Pass and it be done, and I just do it through the NBA app. But then you have all these blackouts, and it's led to some frustration of fans not knowing where they're going to be going for the NBA. Now, this hasn't impacted this year because the NBA's in the last stage of, or the last year of its contract with TNT and ESPN, its current media deal. But as it goes forward, there is concern now that it's going to become much more difficult for people to watch the league. But I think that this hasn't been much of a problem for college football and the NFL. They've been able to navigate these sort of complexities when it comes to who hosts their games. But I think that a bigger issue is the way that the sport is talked about and covered in the larger media spaces. Think about it this way. One of my favorite NFL commentators is Mina Kimes. Mina, of course, works for ESPN and is incredibly knowledgeable on X's and O's type football stuff. And people who like football love her commentary, generally speaking. And there isn't a ton of, just hot take splattering coming from Mina Kimes. And I think that people respect that. There's a lot of other NFL commentators that people respect their opinion on, and it's really just evaluating the game without denigrating the game, right? And in the NBA, I feel like your biggest names are going to be the ones who are the most, old man yelling at the cloud type of people out there. So the prime example there is inside the NBA, which is TNT's very successful post-game and pre-game and halftime show that has Charles Barkley, Shaquille O'Neal, Kenny Smith, and Ernie Johnson. The problem, everybody loves inside the NBA because they make jokes, they're funny, but more often than not, they find themselves just disgusted with the modern game. So more often than not now, you're seeing Shaq or Charles come on TV and say, well, I didn't really watch this game, or not knowing who a player is, or whatever the case may be. And to me, that sends this message to the fan base out there that, hey, look, yeah, we don't care either. We're just cutting the check, and there's this romanticization that they have with the time that they played. And you see it all the time when, like, Steven Jackson and Matt Barnes on All the Smoke, a lot of times they'll say, like, oh, when we played, it wasn't like this. And there's a lot of, like, yeah, but back in my day stuff with a lot of these former players that are doing this sort of stuff, right? And I just don't think it's as much of an issue when you compare it to something like the NFL. Because in the NFL, it's a lot of old players, and they'll say, like, yeah, the rules have changed, but it's mostly from a safety perspective, right? Like, oh, yeah, back when I was playing receiver, you couldn't go up the middle or else you get clotheslined by a safety. Like, yeah, that doesn't sound awesome right now, It's just like, and while there are people who miss that style of play, I feel like a lot of people also appreciate how the game has evolved. Whereas in basketball, evolution is looked at as a little bit of a negative thing because of the way that it's being commented upon. They're not going to find nuance in what's good about the current NBA and compare it to what was good about the previous NBA. It's always, well, everything has gone to shit because we're taking too many threes or doing this or that. And it's just like, it just skews so far into the negativity zone that if you're a fan watching this coverage, why would you think that the NBA was a good product by the way that they're talking, right? So it's like setting it up for failure, and then you have the overt focus on a few players or a few markets or a few teams that leaves a lot of others kind of feel like they're left out in the cold. And again, using the NFL as an example, if a great player is in a small market, that team and that player will be covered, right? In the NBA, it doesn't feel like that. If you're in a smaller market, a lot of times a lot of fans feel like they're not covered fairly, right? They feel like Oklahoma City and Minnesota are not covered in the same way as Golden State or the Lakers or the Knicks or the Celtics, right? So that's another issue where you're kind of creating discontent where even though a lot of national publications focus on the Cowboys a little more than they should, it doesn't mean that the smaller market teams that have interesting, exciting players don't get coverage. Like Bryce Young and the Panthers are getting covered a ton, and they were losing a bunch of games, right? So that's another aspect at play here. Which brings us to the style of play. The main thing I hear, or I think that a lot of people have a problem with the NBA, is kind of like the death of the mid-range jump shot, right? The push into the three-point analytics-based revolution. And, I mean, the numbers are there, right? You can't really deny that it's happened. In 2004, the average NBA team attempted about 15 threes a game. This year, you're looking at about 37 and a half. Add to that, the team that just won the championship did it with Boston Celtics, did that by shooting as many threes as possible, bringing guys in who only knew how to shoot threes, really. Like, you look at guys like Sam Hauser, for example, who are just tailor-made to just, run off of screens and shoot threes. And a lot of people have, as a result, felt that this is becoming, a three-point contest. The other night, the Bulls and the Hornets, I believe, broke an NBA record for amount of missed threes in a game combined. I think it was 75 missed threes combined. And a lot of people just don't find that interesting. They clamor for the 90s and the post play and shooting mid-range jumpers, or the early 2000s, where there was this perception that there was defense played because there was lower points scored. You could argue that, especially with the early 2000s after the hand-checking stuff was removed, that it's really that just players have become more efficient. Like a guy like Allen Iverson, who I loved growing up, was a pretty inefficient scorer. He was shooting quite often 30 to 35% from the field. And you kind of have now these players who shoot well over 50% from the field pretty frequently, and that's because everything has gone to being either you're going to take it to the basket or you're going to shoot the three, because three is worth more than two, where it's become a sort of math problem. And I do think that at times there is a little bit of unfairness in the sense of the whole chucking threes idea. Some teams are guilty of it, but I think you'll watch a team like the Orlando Magic, who play a dirty style, or not dirty, like a more physical style, and you've seen physicality return. The Knicks have played physically over the years. The Celtics at times have played physically, so it's not a thing that's completely gone. But it is a change in the way that the game is played. There's more space now. It's a lot more on shooting versatility and all that. Some people don't find that interesting. There's a lot of ball movement and not as much one-on-one play at times. Like James Harden still does ISO. Jalen Brunson still does ISO a lot, but Luka Doncic does a lot of ISO. But there's been a lot more of an emphasis on spacing, pace, ball movement, that sort of thing. And a lot of people have tuned out on it because there was a craftsmanship, I think, to the old way of scoring in the NBA. So I'll use like Carmelo Anthony as an example. Carmelo had a bunch of like a subset of moves that he would go to get off his shots. And, often it would be from the mid-range, sometimes from three. But it was kind of like watching a technician at work, right? Or like watching Hakeem Olajuwon in the post. He had all these little steps and moves that he could utilize to kind of get to his spot. Now, the guards these days have that. Steph Curry, the way he goes off of screens, James Harden back in the day where the way he could kind of manipulate defenders by having them sit off to the left so he could go to the right. There's a lot of manipulations there, step backs, side steps, those type of actions that players use to get space. But ultimately, the perception now is all they ever do is shoot threes and shoot threes, shoot threes, shoot threes. You see it when you're on a fast break, and instead of going for an easy layup, a player will shoot a three, again, because three is more than two. And I think the big problem that people have is that it has rendered the game of basketball as a math problem, where they're talking about analytics and all this, and I think the reason why football continues to win is because the analytics version of football is throw the ball more and go for it on fourth down. Two things that people generally like to see. In baseball, it's been home run or strikeout, and in basketball, it's been shoot layups or shoot threes. Two things that a lot of the general public doesn't really like. They like post-ups. They like, they say that they like defense, and all that stuff. So it's a big problem for the league, and I think they've tried to address it at times with the implementation of, modifications of what's a foul and, the foul baiting and trying to cut down on flopping. Have they called it consistently? No. But it is something they have tried to make some changes here. I just think that there's a graved in perception now that, the NBA, it's all 3-point shots. It's not exciting. It's not this. It's not that. The next thing, load management. And, when I say load management, I usually think of a guy like Kawhi Leonard, right, who misses a lot of time, managing his injuries and all that. We see it all over. If you play fantasy basketball, you are very familiar with load management, right? And the numbers show that. In the 1990s, every NBA player averaged 10.6 games missed per season. Nowadays, it's closer to 24. And so that's 250% increase from the 90s to today. Why is that? I think that part of it is ring culture, right? For so long, we've been told, and this is kind of like the LeBron generation trying to, live in the shadow of Jordan type thing, where we've been told, or we are telling the NBA players, nothing you do matters until you win rings, right? And not just one ring, multiple rings. So if you're a player and you're a team, you're like, well, I want this is a long regular season, 82 games. I need to make sure that my guy is good to go, ready for the playoffs. And again, the league has tried to mitigate this, right? So they've done the 65-game minimum for awards. They've done different types of things like fining players for missing games where it's like egregious and that sort of thing. But because players only really care about rings, because that's how your greatness is defined in the NFL, or in the NBA, is how many rings do you have? And a lot of times I think in the NFL, when we talk about great players outside of quarterback, and the greatest at their position, we don't really think about the ring counts. Like Lawrence Taylor is widely considered the greatest defensive player of all time. You don't really talk about his rings, I feel like, right? Just the other day, there was a documentary on ESPN about the New York Sack Exchange, the Jets defensive line from the 80s. That team didn't win anything. They never got to a Super Bowl. But there's a characterization of them that makes them iconic to a lot of Jets fans, right? Same way that that's the situation with Taylor, or like Calvin Johnson is revered as one of the greatest wide receivers ever. Never got to a conference championship game while he was a member of the Lions. So, whereas in the NBA, we will ding players a lot for never winning a ring. James Harden is a classic. Chris Paul, James Harden, both of them played together on that Houston team that took Golden State to the edge. Ultimately lost in 7 games. And his greatness and their greatness is going to be discounted because they never won a ring. So when you're telling a player that all that matters is the ring, well, they're kind of prioritized to only care about the playoffs. So the regular season becomes relatively meaningless. And that's, again, why the NBA made a change to institute the NBA Cup, which just wrapped up last night as the Bucks beat the Thunder to win the Cup. And I think that load management is a big problem because I remember when I lived in Detroit, and I would always, the Pistons were and still are kind of a mediocre franchise, and I would kind of want to go to a game when I knew a player would be in town. So I want to go see Phoenix because KD would be playing, right? And a lot of times you'll go to a game and you just hope that a guy isn't load managing. Or else you kind of like, I came to this arena, I paid money for a ticket, blah, 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 to see this guy, and he's not even going to play. And it's frustrating, and I always have felt that if you're going to load manage at home, because if it's avoidable, because your home fans get to see you 41 games out of the year. But when especially if you're like a West Coast team going to the East Coast or vice versa, they only see you once a year. And if you're load managing in that game, then, you're kind of robbing the fans of seeing what they come to see in the NBA, which is great players play. So, like, if you're Luka Doncic and then you're, like, load managing for a game in Charlotte, and those fans in Charlotte came to see you because you're a superstar in this league. And when you don't play, then that kind of leaves a sour taste in their mouth. So it becomes a really big problem. But when it comes to ratings right now, I think a lot of people are worried because, you see a year-to-year drop. That's concerning. I personally am not as worried because the NBA has always been an after-Christmas league, right? Really since the 80s. And that's because the NFL, with how popular as it is, typically dominates the fall in the early winter. And then Christmas rolls around and then this kind of becomes, you kind of start to transition into the NFL playoffs, and then you get full-fledged into NBA come around February, and the All-Star game comes and you ramp up towards the playoffs. Only like the diehard like NBA guys like me are really going to be that locked into every single part of the regular season because it's a long regular season. The NBA season goes from September all the way until June, right? So it's a very long season. So, that's not for everybody. But I think what's happened now is that the football space, so both the NFL and college football, have kind of started to impede a bit on the NBA's turf in that way. So, first thing with the NFL. Competing with the NFL is impossible. It is by far the most popular sport in this country. It dominates local TV ratings. They own a day of the week and Sunday and have started to own other days. There's a game on Monday, a game on Thursdays. Now they're doing games on Saturdays and Black Friday games and all this stuff. And now what was previously the NBA's day, Christmas Day, is now being occupied by the NFL as well, with Netflix picking up a couple of games that is going to be airing on Friday. On Christmas Day. And so that hurts the NBA. That kind of takes eyeballs away from one of its marquee days. But also, people are so locked into football that they're going to just ignore the NBA in the first half of the season, which I think is why they kind of implemented the NBA Cup to kind of give these regular season games a little bit more juice. There's special uniforms, special courts. They're playing for a cup. Everybody has, the players have an incentive to make an extra $500,000 a piece and all that, and so that's part of it. Another thing that's really damaging the NBA at this time of year right now is the college football playoff. Previously, we had the 4-team playoff, and even before that, the BCS championship series. You were it's just like 1 or 2 games and that's it. But now it's a 12-team playoff. It's going to take multiple weeks to determine the champion in college football. And I would argue that college football is the nation's second most popular sport after the NFL. NBA probably comes in third after that. So now you're not only dealing with the NBA or the NFL on Sundays, you're going to be dealing with the college football playoff games on Saturdays for the next few weeks. So for the NBA, you're kind of, in this ratings bind to try and draw eyeballs to your regular season when in reality it's not as high leverage as the NFL. Because right now in the NFL, you have playoff races kicking off. In college football, you have actual playoff games. So if you're the NBA, how do you make a Wednesday night game between Houston and Memphis stick off the page when, they are looking forward to all those football games, right? And that, I think, is an issue that the league has to reckon with. And I do wonder if there's a way to just increase the importance of these regular season games. And to me, the way you do that is by shortening the season. And it's another way that you could eliminate load management, right? Is by shortening the season, by having a wider gap in between games. Because if you did that, and I think utilizing a similar model to the Premier League, where you have a 1 home, 1 away match against, every team in the league. Maybe you have more for your division games to make divisions actually matter again. And that way, every game means just a little bit more. Because if you go from 82 down to 60 games, say, then, that loss to Charlotte means a lot more than it does right now, right? And I think that creates urgency, makes things a little bit more relevant, a little bit more at stake, if you will, right? And I just think that the league now just has to find its hook, right? Because it has this issue where they're it's kind of what happened in the late 90s. They're trying to figure out what's going to happen when we lose LeBron. And the NBA, I think, it's both a good part of it and a bad part of it is that it's a superstar league. The problem with being a superstar league is when you have the superstar, it's awesome. But when the superstar is gone, you have to find his replacement. And they dealt with this when Jordan left. And luckily, Kobe and Shaq kind of filled that void, and then LeBron came, and then, it's been like the LeBron NBA ever since. But now, as LeBron ages, and, he's starting to slow down a little bit this year with injuries and such, and Curry is kind of getting older as well, so is Kevin Durant. Those 3 are going to be kind of hitting to their twilight here in the next few years. You start to think all right, who's the next guy? And there's a lot of talent. The problem is a lot of them are unwilling, right? And Nikola Jokic is an amazing player, of course, shies away from the spotlight. Giannis kind of shies away from the spotlight. Luka seems resident to do it. You have Anthony Edwards as a possibility. Devin Booker doesn't really seem to fit the bill. Neither does Jason Tatum. So you just start to wonder who's going to be the next kind of, quote, face of the league and conversation starter in the league. And that's something that they have to grapple with because on top of making these games more interesting, the league has become incredibly more wide open, so much more parity. But the problem is when you're in the superstar league, that doesn't really work. In the NFL, it works because, any given Sunday, any team could win, that sort of thing. In the NBA, it's a league that's built off of dynasties and dominance. So when you don't have a dynasty and then you don't have dominance, what are you left with? You're left with the NBA in the 70s, which was, historically looking one of the worst decades in the league's history in terms of revenue and all that. Which kind of brings me to my final kind of wondering, I guess. After the last NHL lockout and players' strike, the NHL kind of had to reconfigure itself a bit, and what's happened is become a very niche sport. When I was growing up, you still kind of, you're well aware of the great hockey players out there like Mario Lemieux and Wayne Gretzky and Jaromir Jagr, these guys. Nowadays, you have Connor McDavid, you have Stamkos, obviously Ovechkin and Crosby entering the twilight of their careers, but it's much more regionalized. Like, only certain pockets of the country really like hockey. And I'm starting to wonder if the NBA is becoming a niche sport. And there's nothing wrong with being a niche sport. It's just you're not going to be widespread appeal like you are in football, right? And I think, like, there's been a lot of commentary about how NBA players are too vocal about their political beliefs, and that scared people away. That there's not enough, there's too much flopping, and the pace of play, is just too many shooting threes and all this stuff. It's just driven away a certain piece of the fan base. And I almost wonder, as the NBA turns into this more analytical based type of sport, if we start to see some people draw back, especially if we don't have a proper heir apparent to LeBron. I think it's possible. But I also wonder, is that really a bad thing? Like, if we had more smart basketball minds commenting on it and not having to rely on, like, the hot take machine to cover the sport, that'd probably be pretty good, right? And I just wonder if, like, less is more in that way. And because you need, in basketball, you need to have that larger than life superstar that kind of elevates it. And if you don't have that, then you just kind of have to accept you are who you are. So ultimately, I think that the NBA is having to reckon with this rating stuff. They have countered and said, like, hey, look, our social impressions are through the roof, which to me is a damning statement by Adam Silver, because it shows you that people don't watch the games, right? They could just watch the highlights on TikTok or catch the quick YouTube breakdown. And I feel like that's a problem for the league. That is something that you got to make people want to watch the games. And that's what the NFL has done incredibly well. And, that's another problem that baseball is dealing with as well. How do you get people to want to watch the games? So I think that the NBA has some interesting times ahead of it. We'll have to see how it all shakes out. But I think the league has to kind of look itself in the mirror and kind of think about, what kind of league do we really want to be? And the results, I think, should be telling and incredibly interesting. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap up another episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. If you like the podcast, please consider subscribing and following on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Till next week, I'm your host, Omar Zarat. Catch you later.